The journalist who brought him to London would later write that the whole catastrophe came down to a dinner that never happened. Peter Hunem had spent weeks coaxing one of the most dangerous stories in post-war espionage through the verification machinery of the London Sunday Times. His source was a former Israeli nuclear technician carrying roughly 60 photographs taken inside a facility that officially did not do what its own staff knew it did. The photographs were real. The source was credible. The story was almost ready. And then Hunem heard about the woman. He warned the man directly. He told him that an attractive American tourist appearing in his life at this particular moment, while he was sitting on evidence that would shatter Israel's most protected secret, was exactly what a professional intelligence service would arrange. He proposed a simple test. The three of them would have dinner. Hunem would meet her, watch her, ask her ordinary questions, and form a judgment. The man agreed and then canceled. He chose the woman over the warning. He chose the feeling she had manufactured over the journalist who was trying to keep him alive and free. 3 days later, Mordecai Vanunu was drugged in a Rome apartment, loaded onto a ship, and transported across the Mediterranean to an Israeli prison cell where he would spend the next 11 years in solitary confinement. The dinner that never happened is how this story begins, but it is not where this story starts. What Mordecai Vanunu had seen inside the Negev Nuclear Research Center near Dimona would have been enough to shock even the most senior Western intelligence analyst. Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity had been the accepted fiction of the post-war Middle East for decades. The government's formulation was precise and deliberately hollow. Israel would not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East, technically defensible. Also a cover story for something that had been operating underground, in the most literal sense, since the early 1960s. The facility at Dimona had been built with French technical assistance and concealed from American inspection teams through classified construction and the cooperation of Allied governments willing to accept a useful fiction. Below its surface, 6 floors down, was a plutonium separation plant whose existence Israel had never acknowledged. Its outputs had no peaceful application. They existed for one purpose, and the people who worked inside knew what that purpose was. Vanunu was born in the early 1950s in Marrakesh, Morocco, the second of 11 children. His family immigrated to Israel in 1963 and settled in Beersheba, a small city at the edge of the desert that would become the defining landscape of his life. He grew up poor and became a soldier. He was stationed on the Golan Heights during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where he saw combat. He was honorably discharged the following year. He enrolled at Tel Aviv University to study physics, failed 2 exams at the end of his first year, and left. In the summer of 1976, he applied for a technician's position at the Negev Nuclear Research Center. He was hired. Over the next 9 years, he was given clearance to work in some of the most sensitive areas of a facility that appeared on no public map with any accuracy. He worked in the underground plutonium separation plant, known internally as Macon 2, where irradiated fuel elements from the reactor were reprocessed to extract weapons-grade material. He worked in areas where lithium was being enriched into a specific isotope that would then be used to produce tritium, an essential component of thermonuclear bombs. He saw glove boxes containing nuclear materials in configurations consistent with weapons assembly. He saw models of warhead components. He stood in rooms whose existence the Israeli government would have preferred to deny permanently. What he witnessed was not a research program, it was a production line, and it was operating inside a country that refused all international inspection and maintained in every public forum that its intentions were peaceful. That gap between underground reality and public position was the thing that would eventually become unbearable. He grew politically active during his years at Dimona. His sympathies moved leftward, toward anti-nuclear activism and Palestinian rights, views increasingly at odds with the culture of a classified defense installation. Security officials at the Israel Atomic Energy Commission questioned him more than once about his politics. They recorded their concerns. They did not revoke his clearance or move him to a less sensitive role. Instead, in 1985, they simply eliminated his position. He was laid off. Before he walked out of Dimona for the last time, he brought a personal camera into the facility, a Pentax, small enough for the backpack he routinely carried with his university textbooks. He had been a familiar face at the complex for nearly a decade, and the checkpoint guards did not search the bag. Over several days, working quietly in areas he was still authorized to access, he shot 2 rolls of color film, roughly 60 photographs, glove boxes, weapons, component models. The underground layout of a facility that appeared on no public blueprint. He walked out carrying the most comprehensive visual record of Israel's secret nuclear weapons program that had ever existed in private hands. He left Israel in January of 1986 without telling his family where he was going. He moved east through Nepal, Burma, and Thailand, drifting through the loose infrastructure of budget travel in countries where nobody was looking for him. He carried the film. He carried the knowledge of what was on it. Eventually, he settled in Sydney, Australia, in the King's Cross neighborhood, working first as a dishwasher and then as a taxi driver. He found his way to Street, John's Anglican Church, where a community led by Reverend John McKnight was engaged in social justice work and peace activism. These were the conversations Vanunu had been rehearsing internally for years. In July of 1986, he converted to Christianity and was baptized into the Anglican faith. The conversion cut him off from his family entirely, his parents, his 10 siblings. Everything that had constituted his social world in Israel was now behind a wall he had built himself. He was alone in a way that mattered. That aloneness was a fact that somewhere, in an intelligence file he could not read, had already been noted. At the church, he met Oscar Guerrero, a Colombian freelance journalist who recognized the magnitude of what Vanunu was describing almost immediately. Guerrero told him the photographs and testimony could be worth up to $1 million on the international media market. Whether he was motivated by the public interest of the disclosure or by a brokerage fee has never been resolved. What is documented is that he became the chain's first link. Newsweek passed. He then approached the London Sunday Times. The newspaper assigned Peter Hunem, a seasoned investigative journalist, to evaluate the claim. Hunem flew to Sydney, examined the photographs, questioned Vanunu in detailed technical sessions, and concluded without reservation that the evidence was genuine. In early September of 1986, Hunem brought Vanunu to London. Now, 2 clocks were running simultaneously, and only one of them was in Vanunu's favor. The Sunday Times had been burned badly by the Hitler Diaries forgery, a fabrication that had humiliated editors across Europe. The institutional memory of that failure meant the newspaper would not publish a story about a classified nuclear weapons program on the word of a single technician without independent expert verification. British nuclear scientists were brought in. Vanunu was debriefed in long, probing sessions. The photographs were analyzed against everything publicly known about plutonium reprocessing and weapons design. The verification was necessary and agonizingly slow. It also handed something to the people who wanted Vanunu silenced. Every day the story was not published was another day the intelligence tracking him had to find a way to get him out of London. And somewhere in the weeks of careful journalism, the existence of the Dimona story began to leak through a second channel entirely, one that Vanunu did not control and would not learn about until it was far too late to matter. The unanswered question at this point in the story is not whether Mossad knew where Vanunu was. They knew. The surveillance car outside Hunem's house was one sign. Vanunu's brother in Beersheba was questioned by Shin Bet on September 7th, more than 3 weeks before the abduction. The question is how they found out. Guerrero had been shopping the story to multiple outlets and was alleged by some accounts to have contacted the Israeli consulate directly. The Sunday Mirror's journalists had been making their own inquiries to the Israeli embassy, or the source was something closer, something that has never been fully established. The surveillance operation was already running before any of those external channels would have had time to function. which means someone may have known earlier than anyone has ever been willing to say. That risk was already active before the woman appeared on the London sidewalk, before Vanunu looked up from the crossing near Leicester Square and made a decision that would cost him 18 years of his life. The trap had already been built. He was just walking toward it. To understand what Mossad was actually protecting, you have to look at what was at stake if Vanunu's photographs reached the public, not in abstract terms, in concrete, geopolitical ones. Because the Israeli government's decision to deploy an intelligence agent to lure one nuclear technician out of London and across the Mediterranean was not made out of embarrassment. It was made because what he was carrying threatened to collapse an arrangement that had taken decades to construct, and that the entire architecture of Israeli strategic security depended on. Israel had never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It had declined every international request to allow inspection of the Dimona facility. Its official position, maintained without deviation across multiple governments and decades of diplomatic pressure, was neither confirmation nor denial. No nuclear weapons, no admission, no accountability. This was not an oversight or a diplomatic stall. It was a deliberate strategic posture, sometimes called nuclear opacity, designed to produce a specific effect. Israel wanted its adversaries to believe it might have nuclear weapons without ever triggering the formal international response that an open declaration would invite. The ambiguity was the weapon. Uncertainty was the deterrent. That calculus depended entirely on the absence of proof. As long as no credible evidence existed in the public domain, every government in the world could treat the question of Israel's nuclear status as an open one. The United States in particular had strong institutional reasons to maintain that posture. American law placed restrictions on foreign aid to countries that were developing nuclear weapons outside international safeguards. A confirmed Israeli arsenal, established by photographic evidence verified by independent experts, would have forced a legal and political reckoning in Washington that both governments had quietly agreed to avoid. What Vanunu was carrying in his backpack was the end of that arrangement. Roughly 60 color photographs of the interior of Machon 2, the underground plutonium separation plant at Dimona. Images of glove boxes containing nuclear materials, models of weapons components, documentation of a lithium enrichment process used to produce tritium for thermonuclear weapons. This was not intelligence, speculation, or secondhand testimony. It was primary photographic evidence, taken from inside the facility by a man who had worked there for nearly a decade and knew exactly what he was photographing and why it mattered. When the Sunday Times brought those photographs to independent British nuclear scientists for verification, the analysts did not find ambiguity. They found confirmation. Israel had produced at least 100 nuclear warheads. Some estimates placed the number at 200. The analysts further concluded that the facility was producing material for thermonuclear weapons, designs consistent with hydrogen bombs, not merely the simpler fission devices that most public estimates had assumed Israel was capable of building. The Sunday Times story, when it was eventually published on October 5th of 1986, would describe Israel as a nuclear superpower, a country with an arsenal comparable to Britain or France. The sixth largest nuclear power in the world. That was what Mossad was trying to prevent. And preventing it required two things working in sequence. The operation needed to remove the source before the story could be published with him present to authenticate it. And it needed to do that without leaving a diplomatic body on the floor in London. The constraint around British soil was not a minor operational inconvenience. It was the binding factor that shaped every decision that followed. Mossad had dispatched a tracking unit to London as soon as the intelligence about Vanunu's cooperation with the Sunday Times became actionable. Hunam later recalled noticing two people sitting in a parked car outside his house early one morning, watching the building without apparent purpose. The hit team was under orders to follow Vanunu. It was simultaneously under orders to take no physical action on British territory. Margaret Thatcher and Shimon Peres had cultivated a relationship that both governments valued, and an Israeli snatch operation on a London street would have been a diplomatic grenade. The restraint was strategic calculation, not squeamishness. This meant Mossad needed Vanunu to leave England voluntarily, to get on a plane under his own power, in a jurisdiction where the extraction could be executed cleanly, without creating a bilateral crisis with an allied government. The question was, how to make that happen with a man who had already shown he was alert enough to reach out to a major newspaper, careful enough to have survived months in London without attracting official attention, and surrounded, at least in theory, by a journalist who was watching his movements. That is where the psychological assessment became operational. Mossad profilers evaluated Vanunu's situation with clinical precision. He was estranged from his entire family. He had no romantic relationship. He had converted to a new religion less than 2 months earlier, a conversion that had completed his social disconnection from everyone he had grown up among. He was living alone in a foreign city, dependent for human contact almost entirely on the Sunday Times staff and the members of a church community he had known for less than a year. He was, by every measurable indicator, a man experiencing acute isolation at exactly the moment when the pressure on him was at its most intense. The assessment that came back identified one structural vulnerability. He would respond to attention, to the kind of sustained personal interest that makes a person feel less alone. Mossad decided to manufacture it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the operation, the situation around Vanunu was deteriorating in ways he could not see and Hunem could only partially observe. Oscar Guerrero, the man who had introduced Vanunu to the Sunday Times and collected a fee for doing so, had not stopped working the story once his role as broker was complete. Frustrated by the pace of the newspaper's verification process, or driven by the calculation that the story had multiple buyers, Guerrero approached the Sunday Mirror, the tabloid owned by Robert Maxwell. The Sunday Mirror was not interested in running the story straight. What it published on September 28, 1986, 2 days before Vanunu would board the flight to Rome, was a front-page article headlined, "The Strange Case of Israel and the Nuclear Con Man." The piece called Vanunu, a fraud. It reproduced his photograph. The effect was to place Vanunu's face in public circulation at the worst possible moment. Whether the Sunday Mirror story was designed to discredit him before the Sunday Times could publish, or whether it was a tabloid competitive move with no deeper coordination, its timing was extraordinary. Vanunu was now a named, photographed figure in a major British newspaper. His cover as an anonymous source was burned. His location in London, for anyone paying attention, was essentially confirmed. Vanunu's brother in Beersheba had already been questioned by Shin Bet on September 7th. That date matters. The Sunday Mirror story ran on September 28th. The Shin Bet interview happened 3 weeks earlier, which means Israeli intelligence was tracking Vanunu's activities in London well before the Mirror gave them anything new. Guerrero, according to allegations that were never proven but were widely reported, had contacted the Israeli consulate at some point during the period he was shopping the story. Some accounts suggest this happened before the Sunday Times engagement was even finalized. If true, the man who told Vanunu his evidence was worth $1 million also told the people who would eventually imprison him roughly where to look. None of this was visible to Vanunu. He was sitting in a London safe house, being debriefed by nuclear experts, told repeatedly that the story was nearly ready, that the process took time, that his patience was the last thing standing between the evidence he had risked his life to carry and the public that deserved to know it. He had been warned once about the woman, and he had dismissed the warning. He had no way of knowing that the surveillance unit outside Hunem's house had been there for weeks. He had no way of knowing that his brother had already been visited. He had no way of knowing that the question of how to move him out of England had already been answered, that the answer had a name, and that the name had just arrived in London. What he knew was that a woman he had recently met wanted to take him somewhere warm, and that he had no particular reason to say no. Here is the assumption Phase 2 left standing, that the honey trap was a clean, linear operation. Mossad identified a vulnerability, selected an agent, deployed her, and the target walked straight into the prepared room in Rome. That is the version of the story that gets told most often, and it is not wrong exactly. It just leaves out the friction, the parts that nearly failed, the warning that almost held, and the structural flaw in the cover identity that should have been fatal but wasn't, for a reason that had nothing to do with Mossad's tradecraft and everything to do with Vannunu's choices. She arrived in London in the last week of September 1986. She was using the name Cindy, a variant of her real first name rather than a fully fabricated alias, which is itself a tradecraft choice worth noting. Mossad had not built her a deep cover identity with a constructed history, a manufactured employment record, a backstopped address. The operation was not designed to survive extended scrutiny. It was designed to survive 5 to 7 days of casual social contact with a man who was lonely, recently converted to a new faith, and living in a foreign city without a support network that would notice behavioral changes quickly. The cover did not need to be strong. It needed to be just strong enough for the purpose. The encounter happened on a street near Leicester Square. Decades later, Vannunu would tell Israeli television that he had been the one to approach her. They were crossing the street, he started a conversation, and the woman seemed happy to talk. This detail is easy to accept at face value and harder to accept under operational scrutiny. Mossad had been running surveillance on Vannunu's movements for weeks. They knew his routines, which areas he frequented, roughly how he moved between locations. Placing an agent in a position where the target would feel he was initiating contact is a standard technique, not a coincidence. Whether the Leicester Square meeting was staged or simply a trained agent seizing a natural opening cannot be established from the public record. What can be established is that it happened exactly when the operation needed it to. Over the next few days, they met 2 or 3 times. Coffee, a walk, the texture of early, easy friendship between people who have just found each other in a large city. She presented herself as an American tourist from the eastern United States, which was true in the factual sense that she had grown up in Pennsylvania and Florida and carried an American accent. The cover was thin by design, but it was also structurally reinforced by a genuine biographical reality. She was not entirely pretending to be American. She was American, operating under a simplified version of her own identity. This is a refinement in deception that makes a cover harder to crack. There are no invented details to forget or contradict. Hunam found out about the woman on a Monday morning when Vannunu mentioned her. The journalist's reaction was immediate. He told Vannunu directly and without diplomatic softening that what he was describing was a classic operational pattern. An attractive American woman appearing in the life of a man sitting on one of the most sensitive intelligence disclosures of the decade during the final days before publication, in a city where a foreign intelligence service was known to have active surveillance in place. He told Vannunu this was exactly what a honey trap looked like. He used those words, or words close to them. He then proposed the dinner, the 3 of them together, an evening that would give Hunam the chance to observe her behavior, ask her questions that a genuine tourist would answer differently than a trained operative, and form a professional judgment about whether the connection was real. Vannunu agreed to the dinner. Then he canceled it. He told Hunam he would not be bringing her. He went to see her alone. This is the moment the operation succeeded, and it succeeded not because of what Cindy did, but because of what Vannunu chose. The warning had been given clearly. The test had been offered practically. He had the information and the means to verify his suspicion. He chose not to. This is not a failure of intelligence or counterintelligence training, because Vannunu had none. It is something more ordinary and more devastating. He was a man who had been alone for most of a year, in the middle of the most dangerous period of his life, and someone who seemed to understand him had appeared. The pull of that was stronger than the pull of a journalist's caution. What Cindy was managing during those days, from the other side of the cover, was its own kind of pressure. She was an operative in the field, running a brief honey trap against a target who had already received a direct warning from someone who was watching both of them. The dinner proposal was a threat to the operation. If Hunam had sat across from her for 2 hours and asked the right questions, the mission was over. Her job in the 2 days after the dinner was proposed was not just to maintain warmth and trust with Vanunu. It was to ensure the dinner never happened without making Vanunu feel maneuvered. He had to cancel it himself, for reasons that felt like his own. That is the harder part of the assignment, and it is the part that the public record cannot fully explain, because the interior of the conversation between them in those days is not documented. What is documented is the outcome. The dinner was cancelled. Vanunu did not tell Hunam he was about to leave the country. Now, there is a second assumption worth breaking. The standard account of the honey trap treats Cindy as the sole operative responsible for getting Vanunu out of London. In April of 2021, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported that sources familiar with the case had described a detail that had not been part of the public record until then. According to these sources, Cindy was not the only female operative deployed against Vanunu. A second woman, whose identity has never been publicly established, was reportedly involved in the operation at some stage. Haaretz did not specify her precise role, when she was active, or whether her assignment overlapped with Cindy's or preceded it. The report stands as sourced but thin, a claim from unnamed sources in a paywalled article that has not been corroborated elsewhere in detail. What it does to the standard narrative is significant, however. If a second operative was involved, then what Vanunu experienced as a natural, chance encounter with one person may have been the visible surface of a layered operation. A secondary agent could have been used to gather behavioral intelligence on Vanunu in the days before Cindy was deployed, identifying his routines, his emotional state, the specific kind of attention he was most likely to respond to. Or she could have been a contingency, a backup positioned in case the primary contact failed. The operation, in that reading, was not a single agent with a simple cover. It was an architecture that Vanunu never saw the full shape of. On September 28, 1986, the Sunday Mirror published its story. Robert Maxwell's paper ran Vanunu's photograph and called him a fraud. Whatever its intent, the timing placed Vanunu in a new kind of danger. His face was now in a major British publication. His presence in London as the source of a nuclear disclosure story was no longer a secret within a small circle of journalists and scientists. It was a public record. A man identified by name and photograph in a national newspaper, accused of being a hoaxer, sitting in a safe house waiting for the other newspaper's story to vindicate him. 2 days later, he boarded a plane. He was not fleeing. He believed he was going on a holiday. He had chosen to trust the woman over the journalist's warning, and the woman had bought the tickets, and there was a flight from London to Rome that evening. Whether he felt any hesitation at the airport is not part of the documented record. What is documented is the flight number, British Airways 504. Departing London, September 30th, 1986, at approximately 9 in the evening. The woman beside him was relaxed. The man waiting at the other end had been in position for hours. The cover had held. Now the room was waiting. The room was not empty. 2 men were inside when Vanunu and Cindy arrived at the Rome apartment on the evening of September 30th. They moved the moment the door closed. Vanunu was forced to the floor, handcuffed at wrists and ankles, injected with a sedative. In his 2004 press conference, he described one attacker as Israeli and the other as French. Within seconds, the drug took hold. He was carried out, loaded into a van, driven to a beach, transferred by motorboat to a vessel waiting offshore. Cindy did not struggle. She watched. What began that night, in a different city, with a different man, was a search that would take nearly 2 years to produce a name and nearly a decade beyond that to produce an address. Peter Hunam understood within days that Vanunu had not simply gone quiet. On October 5, 1986, the Sunday Times published the Dimona story. Revealed, the secrets of Israel's nuclear arsenal. The paper had what it needed and went to print while its primary source was on a ship crossing the Mediterranean in handcuffs. For weeks, the Israeli government denied any knowledge of Vanunu's whereabouts. Hunem had published one of the most significant intelligence disclosures of the post-war period with his key witness missing, somewhere between London and a city that had not yet been named. The breakthrough came from Vanunu himself, from inside a prison van on the way to a court hearing he had not been permitted to attend publicly. Israeli authorities had placed him in pretrial detention and had restricted all access. He could not speak to journalists, could not make public statements, could not communicate the basic fact of what had been done to him in Rome, so he asked a guard for a pen. The guard gave him one. Vanunu wrote on the palm of his left hand. Vanunu M. was hijacked in Rome, ITL. Came to Rome by Fly BA 504. As the transport van passed a cluster of waiting photographers and journalists outside the courthouse, he pressed his open palm against the window glass. An Associated Press photographer captured the image. It went around the world. That photograph did two things simultaneously. It confirmed to the public that Vanunu had been abducted from Italy by Israeli intelligence rather than returning voluntarily. And it handed Hunem the only piece of operational data he needed to start dismantling the cover, BA 504. A specific British Airways flight from London to Rome, departing September 30th at approximately 9 in the evening. Hunem obtained booking records for that flight. 2 seats had been purchased together, one under the name of Mordecai Vanunu, the other under the name Cindy Hanin. The search now had a name, 2 words that were at once familiar and slightly off. Cindy was a real American first name. Hanin was a plausible Jewish surname. The combination felt like someone's actual name, not a fully constructed alias, which was accurate. Hunem began searching through American public records. He found a Cindy Hanin living in Orlando, Florida, who was engaged to be married. Young, Jewish, the right age, the right geography. But she was clearly not a Mossad operative about to walk down an aisle. She was not the right person. She was, however, connected by family to the right person. The woman in Orlando was marrying into the Bentov family. Hunem followed the family tree out of Florida and into Israel and found a woman named Cheryl, born Cheryl Hanin, who had left the United States as a teenager, joined the Israeli military in 1978, and was now living with her husband Ofer Bentov in the coastal town of Netanya, north of Tel Aviv. Ofer Bentov was himself an Israeli intelligence officer. The neighborhood in Netanya, where they lived, was, by local reputation, one where security and intelligence professionals tended to settle. Hunem traveled to Israel. He checked his findings against hotel registration records from London, from the period when Cindy had been staying in the city and meeting with Vanunu. The descriptions on file and the physical details he was assembling around Cheryl Hanin Bentov aligned. He located the bungalow. He knocked on the door. When she opened it, Hunem asked her directly whether she was the Mossad agent who had used the name Cindy to lure Mordecai Vanunu to Rome. He later wrote that there was a visible flash of recognition in her face before the denial came. "I deny it. I deny everything." The door closed. Hunem took a few photographs before she disappeared inside. By that evening, the house was empty. Cheryl and Ofer Bentov had cleared out completely. The confrontation in Netanya established her identity beyond reasonable doubt for Hunem's purposes. The hotel records, the flight booking, the family connection to the cover name, the physical match, and the unmistakable involuntary recognition before the denial all pointed the same direction. He published his findings. The Sunday Times named her. Her career in Mossad, to the extent it had any active dimension remaining, was finished. Hunem later reflected that unmasking a serving intelligence operative had been one of the few ways the journalism of the story could fight back against what had been done to its source. But the trail did not end in Netanya. It went quiet for nearly a decade and then resurfaced in an American state database. In 1997, another Sunday Times reporter found Cheryl Hanin Bentov living in the Orlando area, not far from where she had grown up. She was working for CFI Sales and Marketing, a company connected to Westgate Resorts, a major timeshare operation headquartered in Central Florida. When approached, her only expressed concern was that any published story should not harm her position in the United States. She was terminated from CFI that same year. What followed that termination was quieter and more revealing than anything she said directly. The Street. Petersburg Times, a Florida newspaper, began looking into her background and found that state records listed Cheryl Henin as holding an active real estate sales license, employed by CFI. After the newspaper made inquiries, those records changed. The license was reclassified as inactive. The reference to CFI was removed from the state database. The alterations were not the work of a former operative tidying her own paperwork. State licensing records are not administered by the individuals they document. Someone was still maintaining the cover. A decade after a Rome apartment, in an American state employment database, someone with the means and motivation to access those records had made them less informative. This is the detail that shifts the Hunam detective trail from a historical footnote into a different kind of story entirely. The operation that lasted 3 days in September of 1986 was still being managed in 1997. The cleanup was ongoing. The identity that had been built for 1 week of operational use was being protected, years later, in a Florida suburb, for reasons that were never officially explained. Cheryl Henin Bentov settled in Longwood, a quiet community in the greater Orlando area. She took up real estate work under her maiden name, which is the name she had used on the British Airways boarding pass in 1986. She did not grant interviews. She did not issue statements. When journalists found her in subsequent years, her responses varied between flat denial and requests for privacy. She never publicly confirmed or denied being Cindy. She did not need to. The investigative record Hunam had assembled was already conclusive. What the detective trail ultimately answered was the question that Phase 3 left open, not just who Cindy was, but how thin the cover had actually been. The name on the boarding pass was close enough to her real name that a determined journalist could trace it through a family connection. The hotel registration details were specific enough to match. The neighborhood in Netanya was one where people in her profession lived. The cover was designed to hold for a week, not a decade, and when Hunam pulled on the right thread, it came apart in under 2 years. The question it left open was smaller but harder. Why, 11 years after the operation, was someone still altering state records in Florida to protect it? The question, Phase 4 left unanswered, was about maintenance. Why was someone still protecting a cover identity 11 years after it had served its purpose? To answer that, you have to understand what the cover identity actually was, where it came from, and why it was chosen over a deeper, more elaborate construction. Because the choice to use a thin cover on this operation was not an oversight. It was a deliberate read of the target, and understanding that read is what reveals how the operation actually worked, which is not the way it has usually been described. Cheryl Henin was born in the late 1950s in Pennsylvania and grew up partly in Orlando, Florida, in a Jewish family. Her father, Stanley Henin, had built a modest commercial enterprise, Allied Discount Tires. It was an ordinary American upbringing in a city that had no particular connection to intelligence work or to the Middle East. What changed the trajectory was a single decision made in high school. She spent a semester studying in Israel at the Alexander Muss Institute for Israel Education in Hod HaSharon, a program that brought Jewish students from the diaspora into close contact with Israeli culture, language, and national identity. When she graduated in 1978, she did not return to the United States. She joined the Israeli Defense Forces. The IDF enlistment of a woman raised in Florida in a Jewish family in 1978 was not unusual. The program she had attended was specifically designed to produce exactly that kind of outcome, the strengthening of connection between diaspora communities and the Israeli state. What she did in the military in those years is not part of the public record. What is documented is that by 1985 she had married Ofer Ben-Tov, an Israeli intelligence officer, and that at some point before 1986 she was recruited and trained by Mossad. The training, as described by intelligence author Gordon Thomas, drawing on sources close to the agency, was not preparation for deep cover work spanning months. It was functional preparation for a specific category of mission. She was put through a series of escalating exercises, breaking into an occupied hotel room without detection, removing documents from an office, being woken in the middle of the night and sent to a club with instructions to pick up a stranger, sustain a convincing interaction, and disengage outside his hotel without raising suspicion. Every exercise was observed. The instructors were not building her into someone who could maintain a fabricated identity for months. They were building her into someone who could be credible for days, in a context where the only verification available to the target was his own emotional response to her presence. That is the operational logic the training was designed to serve, and it is the logic that shaped the cover identity she was given for the Vanunu mission. She did not use a constructed name. She used a close variant of her own. She did not invent a background. She used a simplified version of her real one. She was American because she genuinely was American, raised in Florida, carrying a natural accent that required no maintenance. The cover was a reduction of her actual biography rather than a fabrication built on top of it. This is a specific and deliberate choice. A reduction is much harder to crack than an invention because there are no seams where the false material meets the real. There is nothing to forget, nothing to contradict, nothing that requires active performance. The operative simply presents a narrower version of who she already is. What was added was the fiction of the sisters' flat in Rome and the suggestion of the holiday, both thin and built for exactly this use, designed to last precisely as long as the operation required and no longer. The cover did not need depth. It needed credibility for 5 to 7 days with a man who had no access to a background check, no support network conducting surveillance on his behalf, and no reason to suspect that a friendly American tourist was anything other than what she appeared to be, except that he had been told, explicitly, by a journalist whose professional life was built on exactly the kind of suspicion the situation warranted. And here is the reframe. The standard account of this operation treats it as a successful intelligence action because Mossad deployed a trained operative who maintained a convincing cover and delivered the target to the extraction team on schedule. That account is accurate as far as it goes, but it describes the surface of what happened, not the mechanism underneath. The honey trap did not succeed because Cheryl Hanin Bentov's cover was strong. It succeeded because Mordecai Vanunu chose not to test it. He was given a warning. He was offered a practical means of verification. He accepted neither. He canceled the dinner, went to see her alone, and boarded a flight to Rome without telling the one person in London who was trying to protect him. This reframes everything. The operation's most important moment was not the seizure in the apartment. It was not the training in the hotel rooms. It was not the boarding pass, the name on the ticket, the man waiting at the airport. The operation's most important moment was a Monday morning conversation in London, in which a journalist told a source that the woman he was seeing could be an intelligence asset, and the source decided that the feeling she gave him was worth more than the warning. There is no tradecraft on Earth that produces that outcome by force. No cover identity, however well constructed, can make a person dismiss an explicit warning from a trusted colleague. What produced it was something the intelligence service did not build and could not have engineered. It was Vanunu's isolation, his longing, the specific weight of being alone in a foreign city for months, carrying a secret that had severed him from every person who had ever known him, while someone who seemed to understand him offered him a week in Rome. The honey trap does not work by fooling people who are paying attention. It works by becoming the thing a person has already decided they want to believe. The cover does not need to withstand scrutiny. It only needs to be more appealing than scrutiny. And in that specific moment, with that specific man, it was. Mossad's psychologists had read Vanunu correctly. Not perfectly, not with certainty, but correctly enough. They identified the structural vulnerability, selected an operative whose biographical reality could be shaped into the right kind of presence, gave her a cover thin enough to be credible and simple enough to maintain, and positioned her where the target would encounter her. The rest was not their work. The rest was his. This is the mechanism that the history of the operation tends to obscure. It is more comfortable to narrate a brilliant deception than to narrate a man who was warned and chose not to listen. The first story is about Mossad's competence. The second story is about something harder to look at directly, the fact that the most effective intelligence weapon deployed against Mordecai Vanunu was not an agent or a cover or a Roman apartment. It was the need for connection that 10 months of isolation had made acute enough to override everything else. That need is not a weakness specific to him. It is the operational premise of every honey trap ever run by every intelligence service against every target who has ever been successfully lured. The cover does not need to be strong. The loneliness only needs to be real. Vanunu boarded the flight. He had the photographs and the story behind him, already in print, or nearly so, already in the world. He had weeks of London safe houses and expert debriefs, and the grind of careful journalism that had consumed him since September. He had a woman beside him who had bought the tickets and told him her sister had a flat in Rome. He did not tell Peter Hunam he was leaving. He did not leave a note. He did not make a phone call. By the time anyone who might have stopped him knew he was gone, British Airways Flight 504 had already crossed the French coast and was tracking south. The cover had never needed to be perfect. It had only needed to last until Rome. The plane landed at approximately 9 in the evening on September 30th, 1986. Rome. The air outside the terminal was warm. The city was indifferent. Nobody was looking at them. Vanunu was relaxed. This was the false release. He had been living inside a story of danger for weeks. Safe houses, expert debriefs, the creeping suspicion, voiced once by Hunam and then set aside, that someone was watching. But now the Sunday Times story was nearly done. The evidence was in the world or close to it. The hardest part, the part that required him to sit in London and answer questions and wait, was over. He was in Rome with a woman he trusted, and whatever had been pressing on him for months had lifted enough that the city felt like a holiday rather than an escape. He was wrong about what had lifted. He was wrong about nearly everything at that moment. At the arrivals hall, a man was waiting. Cindy introduced him as a friend. The introduction was warm and unremarkable. Vanunu did not ask questions. He had no reason to. He had been told there would be a contact at the airport, that someone would help them get to the flat. He got into the car. They drove through Rome. Vanunu watched the city go past the window. He was not counting turns. He was not noting the direction of travel or timing the journey or doing any of the things a person under threat would do. He was a passenger. He had been a passenger for most of the previous year, trusting first Guerrero, then Hunam, then the Sunday Times, and now Cindy. The habit of trust had been the thread running through his entire journey from Dimona to Sydney to London to this car moving through an Italian city at night. The flat was in a residential district. They went inside. What happened in the next few seconds moved fast. The two men who had been inside the apartment were positioned. They had been waiting for the door to close. When it did, they moved at the same time from different angles, which is the standard method when the target must be controlled before he can react. One took Vanunu from behind. The other went for his legs. They forced him to the floor in a controlled fall designed to prevent injury to the operative rather than to the target. Handcuffs went onto his wrists. Handcuffs went onto his ankles. His face was against the floor. He was shouting. He looked up and saw Cindy. She was standing. She was not restrained. She was not struggling. She was watching. He still did not fully understand. He told journalists 18 years later that in that moment, even with the men on top of him and the handcuffs already locked, he thought she was also a victim. He thought the men had seized both of them. He thought she was standing there in shock rather than in complicity. The cover held even as it collapsed. This is the most precise measure of how well it had been built. Not that it withstood scrutiny from outside, but that the target could not relinquish it even while the room was being dismantled around him. Then the needle went in. The drug was a sedative with paralyzing properties. The specific compound has never been publicly identified. What Vanunu described was a rapid loss of physical control followed by loss of consciousness. Seconds. The room went dark. When he came back, he was in a vehicle, moving. He did not know how long had passed. He did not know where he was. He did not know if it was still the same night. He was disoriented, his body still not fully responding, the sedative somewhere between wearing off and holding. But the drug had not taken hold as completely as the operatives needed. He was conscious. He was in the back of the van, and in the fragmented, compressed logic of a man who had been injected and was still trying to think through what was real, one idea surfaced and sharpened into purpose. He could cause a crash. He lunged for the driver. He did not manage it cleanly. His coordination was compromised, his handcuffs restricted his range, and the men in the vehicle were expecting resistance. They subdued him immediately and administered a second dose. The attempt lasted seconds. It accomplished nothing except to confirm to the operatives that the dosage had been insufficient and would need to be corrected. The moment Vanunu had just attempted was the only moment between the London sidewalk and the Israeli border where the operation was at genuine physical risk. It failed. He went under again. He came to on a beach. He did not know which one. The Italian coastline, at night, isolated, no lights nearby, the kind of location that had been chosen precisely because there was nothing there that could witness what came next. He was transferred from the van to a motorboat. The transfer was physical and rough. He was moved as cargo. The motorboat took him offshore. There was a vessel waiting in open water, dark against the Mediterranean at night. It was reportedly the INS Noga, an Israeli signals intelligence ship that had been positioned in advance. He was taken below deck. He was not given the run of the cabin. He was handcuffed to a bed in a space below the waterline and kept there. The ship began to move south and then east. Vanunu would later say that even during the sea crossing, he believed other Western intelligence services had been involved, that the British and French and Americans had all played a role in what was happening to him. This was an incorrect assumption, the one his mind constructed to make the scale comprehensible. A single Mossad team with one operative had managed it. The apparatus that felt, from inside a ship's cabin, like an international intelligence collaboration, was considerably smaller than that. The assumption inflated the threat retrospectively, in the way that minds do when they have been outmaneuvered by something they did not see coming. We make the thing that caught us larger than it was, because the alternative is to admit how narrow the gap was between what we knew and what we needed to know. He was sick for most of the crossing, handcuffed to the bed, sedated, at sea. The journey took roughly 2 weeks. He arrived in Israel in early October. The ship docked. He was transferred to a vehicle. The vehicle drove to Ashkelon. By the time he arrived at the prison, the Sunday Times had already published the story. On October 5, 1986, the photographs he had taken inside Dimona appeared on one of the most widely read newspaper front pages in the world. The story he had risked his life to bring out was in the public domain. The evidence was there. The nuclear secret of the 6th largest arsenal on Earth had been confirmed by independent experts and printed in black and white in London. It changed almost nothing about what happened to him. He was processed into Ashkelon. He was placed in a cell. The door closed. Outside the prison, for weeks, the Israeli government said nothing about where he was or how he had come to be there. No statement, no acknowledgement. The operation had been completed. The cover had held long enough, and the man who had carried those 2 rolls of film out of Dimona in his backpack was now the government's problem to manage, rather than Mossad's problem to solve. Cindy had done what she was sent to do. She was already gone. The trial opened on August 31, 1987, at the Jerusalem District Court. The courtroom was sealed. The press was excluded. The public was barred. The proceeding was presided over by Chief Justice Eliyahu Noam and Judges Zvi Tal and Shalom Brenner. Vanunu's defense attorney, the Israeli civil rights lawyer Avigdor Feldman, stood outside the courthouse and told the journalists gathered there that the secrecy was exaggerated, that there was no reason to hide the defendant's face from the public, that the state's paranoia on the nuclear issue had overwhelmed any pretense of transparency. The government's position was that the trial had to be closed to protect state secrets. The irony that those secrets had already appeared in the Sunday Times was not officially acknowledged. On February 27, 1988, the court delivered its verdict, guilty of treason and espionage. 18 years in prison, calculated from the date of his capture. The Israeli government refused to release the trial transcript. Under threat of legal action more than a decade later, censored extracts were eventually published in the newspaper Yedioth Ahronoth in 1999. What those extracts confirmed and what they continued to conceal has never been fully established. Italy was never formally notified that an abduction had taken place on its soil. No Italian court was asked to authorize the operation. No extradition process was followed. The legal framework that governs the transfer of individuals between sovereign states was not consulted. The operation simply happened, and its aftermath was managed in Israeli courts under Israeli law, and the question of whether what occurred in the Rome apartment on September 30, 1986, was a kidnapping conducted in violation of international law has never been adjudicated anywhere. The cell at Ashkelon, where Vanunu was placed in solitary confinement, had no window for the first 2.5 years. No natural light entered the space. The passage of time was measurable only by meals and guard rotations. The solitary confinement was not prescribed by any provision of Israeli law and was not specified in his sentence. It was an administrative decision, renewed year after year, for more than 11 years. When petitions to the High Court argued that his mental health was deteriorating under conditions that no statute had authorized, it was not until 1999 that the court ordered him moved to the general population at Ashkelon. What sustained him across those years, by his own account, was a series of private disciplines. He read the New Testament aloud for 1 hour every day. He exercised in the space available. He meditated. He sang loudly, using his voice as the one instrument of defiance available in a cell without windows, without visitors, without any sustained human presence. He had access to foreign broadcasts. He knew that Daniel Ellsberg, who had leaked the Pentagon Papers more than a decade before Vanunu photographed Dimona, called him the preeminent hero of the nuclear era. He knew the world remembered him. It was not the same as company. He was released on April 21, 2004. He walked out of Ashkelon prison after 18 years. At the press conference he held that day, he said he was proud of what he had done. He had no regrets. He challenged Israel to open Dimona to international inspection. Then he said something no one present anticipated. He told the journalists that he did not believe the woman who had lured him to Rome was a Mossad agent. She was either an FBI or a CIA agent. He described her as a young woman from Philadelphia. Whether this was a psychological defense, a genuine alternative theory he had arrived at across 18 years of reflection, or a deliberate provocation aimed at the security establishment that had imprisoned him, nobody who was there that day could say with confidence. 18 years had done something to the cover that 3 days of operational deployment had not. It had convinced the man it trapped that the trap might have belonged to someone else. Freedom, when it came, turned out to be a narrower condition than the word suggests. The Israeli government imposed restrictions that amounted to a second confinement built in open air. Vanunu could not leave the country. He could not speak with foreign nationals. He could not give media interviews without prior approval. He was not issued a passport. He could not approach airports or seaports. In the years that followed his release, he was arrested multiple times for violating these terms, meeting a journalist, talking to a foreign supporter, existing, visibly, in the city where he had been sentenced. After he gave an interview to Israel's Channel 2 in 2015, describing the honey trap and the abduction in detail on national television, The Shin Bet Security Service formally requested a police investigation into whether statements he made beyond what the military censor had approved constituted a breach. The interview had been cleared. The investigation was opened anyway. In 2015, he married Kristin Joachimsen, a Norwegian woman. Norway invited him to settle there with his wife. He could not go. The travel ban remained. As of the most recent public reporting, it still does. He lives in East Jerusalem, near the Anglican Cathedral of St. George's. He rings the church bell at noon. From the bell tower, he can see the Jerusalem courthouse where he was sentenced 4 decades ago. He looks down at it from above and does not leave. Now pay off the question Phase 4 left unanswered. The Florida state records that were quietly altered after the St. Petersburg Times started asking questions in 1997 were not altered to protect Cheryl Hanine Bentov from embarrassment. She had already been publicly named and photographed. Her role had been published by the Sunday Times nearly a decade earlier. The alteration of a Florida employment database served a different purpose. It made it harder to establish where she was, who employed her, and whether the thread that connected the woman in the Longwood suburb to the woman in the Rome apartment was still active. Someone with both the access and the motivation to sanitize a state licensing database had decided, 11 years after the operation, that the paper trail around Cindy still needed management. That decision implies continuity. Not necessarily of active operations, but of institutional attention to an identity that was not fully retired. Cheryl Hanine Bentov lives in Longwood, Florida, in a quiet suburban neighborhood northeast of Orlando. She works as a real estate agent under her maiden name, which is the same name that appeared on the British Airways boarding pass in September of 1986. She does not grant interviews. She does not issue statements. When journalists have located her over the decades, her responses have ranged from denial to quiet requests that they not publish anything that would affect her standing in the United States. She has never been charged with a crime in any jurisdiction. She has never been compelled to account, in any public forum, for what was done in Rome. She has 2 daughters. She lives in the city where she grew up. Vanunu cannot leave the country where he was imprisoned. The operation did not fail. That is not the point of this story. The operation succeeded completely in the way that operations built around a correct psychological assessment tend to succeed. The Mossad profilers had read Vanunu accurately. He was isolated and needed connection. They provided a version of it that was real enough to override the only warning he received. He canceled the dinner. He got on the plane. The cover held exactly as long as it needed to. The point is what that success required and what it left behind. The honey trap does not work by constructing an impenetrable deception. It works by finding the thing a person most needs and becoming it. The cover only has to be more compelling than the warning. In 1986, in London, for one man in one specific condition of loneliness and longing, it was. The rest is documented consequence. 18 years, 11 of them without light. A marriage he cannot live inside. A bell tower over a courthouse. A woman in Florida who has nothing to say about any of it. That asymmetry is not an accident of outcome. It is the intended result of a method that was designed from the beginning to impose all of its costs on the target and none on the operative. If this kind of history is worth your attention, subscribe to Hidden Ops. We cover verified intelligence operations and the real people they were built around.